So this video is all going to be about the story of life. Where does it come from? How did it first get, how did it first show up on Earth? How did this possibly even happen on our planet? Um, it's a big question. It's a huge question. You can imagine people have been thinking about it since the beginning of existence, wondering like, where did we come from? How did life get here? And lots of different stories have been created, and lots of different civilizations. So it depends on who you ask where life came from. If you talk to an ancient Greek, you get the story of Gaia and the Greek gods and Kronos and all the infighting and all of that, and it's amazing stories. Okay. But then if you went and talked to somebody from ancient Egypt, they'd have this. There's a couple, 9 or 10 different stories from there, like the story of Atun, and talk about how life came out of the Nile River and how the water and the earth gave birth to humans and our existence on the planet. Or you go to the Chinese culture and the Taoist culture had this man called Pan Ku who was born out of an egg and he was a hairy man with horns and gave birth to all of existence on the planet. All of those are stories. All of those are things that people have been pondering about since the beginning of time, beginning of existence. Why are we here? But if you talk to a scientist, well, they'll say it all started with atoms. And this is what we're going to take the approach of because these are things that we can show evidence for. These are things that we can actually explore and see proof through experiments that these things are possible. It doesn't mean it may not be exactly right. Okay? There may be other things at play, but what we can do is we can find evidence, we can track things through experiments, we can do different tests to confirm some of our theories about why life might exist. So, where did life come from? Well, we've got a tree over there, right? It's complex life. How did it possibly get here? Well, when the Earth first started, it was full of what are called inorganic molecules, right? So back billions and billions and billions of years ago, there's all these inorganic molecules moving around all over the Earth's surface, and you know, there's no way that these inorganic molecules are just going to go and form a tree. Okay, hydrogen gas, nitrogen gas, they're not things that just bind together and go form trees. It doesn't happen that way. So how did it happen? Well, took a long time. It takes lots of steps to get from one to the other. We're going to kind of explore a lot of that. So when one of the first steps is that those inorganic molecules are going to have to find some way to form organic molecules, things that make up the building blocks of life. Then those organic molecules, when fused together and form what are called simple cells, extremely simple cells, very simple functionality, not much to them. We'll talk more about those later, but that would be the next step, right? Next level of complexity. And then those simple cells are going to evolve and they're going to form complex cells, which have even more complexity to them, more things going on inside them, more kinds of places to create, store, and use energy. And eventually those complex cells are going to fuse together, evolve, and create the tree, and they're going to become that complex life. Okay, so this is going to be the process that we're going to go through, trying to figure out how we get through all four of these steps, going from one to the going from one to the next. Okay? But one thing to understand is this kind of goes back to what we saw with genetics. We saw one small change made a big difference in terms of what proteins being expressed. This key concept, the idea of the complexity for mutations and genes developing, different traits developing, that complexity is going to rise from many small, less complex steps. And that's a key theme to explaining how our biological world works. So you think about the Legos, you have all these different Legos all over the place, right? And to build that huge thing, it's just going to take one Lego at a time moving into the right place. And that's kind of what's happened with um, evolution and development of people over time, is that things have slowly evolved, slowly changed, taking small steps over and over and over again. But if you do over a long period of time, eventually you're going to end up with a more complex structure. So again, what we're going to focus on today in this talk though is that first step, those inorganic molecules to organic molecules. How is that possibly going to happen? So the first thing to understand though is that there's got to be a difference. And what are the differences between organic and inorganic molecules? Okay, why is this inorganic molecule on the left inorganic, and what makes the organic molecule on the right organic? So these are some of the general differences. There are more specific differences, but these are the base ones that we really need to be worried about. The fact that inorganic molecules are not carbon based. Okay, they're going to have other molecules at the base of them, and they're not going to be used to build organisms. Okay, one example of that is hydrogen gas. Okay, hydrogen gas is, you don't build anything out of hydrogen gas other than hydrogen gas. You're not going to build an animal or a plant out of hydrogen gas. Whereas organic molecules do have a carbon backbone to them. They have a carbon base, and they are used to build organisms. One example of that is a fatty acid. So you can see in this fatty acid right here, you have that black carbon backbone. Okay, you have some oxygen atoms here, and then you have some hydrogen atoms here. But the fact that you have that carbon backbone means it's something that could be used to build an organism. And we know it is because it's a fat, and there's fats everywhere throughout all living organisms. So the big difference there is in inorganic molecules, we don't have a big carbon backbone, but in organic, we do. So how is it possible to go from one to the next? Well, we have to go back really, really far and think about what did ancient Earth look like. And it might look something like this. This is an artist rendition, but that's okay. What you can see is you see lots of lightning, you see lots of energy there. There's some steam coming off out of these vents, okay, which is going to have the water. You have the molten rocks. You have all these minerals. You have all these different compounds and all this energy and all this transfer and all this changing material. Um, and remember, we're talking about like billions of years ago. So we're talking so long ago that there's a lot of time for things to happen. Um, and those small changes we talked about happening that could eventually lead to bigger things, right? So how could this possibly have bred life? Well, scientists theorized, okay, well, maybe there's a way to make organic molecules from inorganic molecules, because that's probably what's floating around out here. There's nothing living, there's no trees, there's no plants, there's no nothing. So somehow or another we had to make organic compounds out of this inorganic material. So um, these two scientists got together and they devised a test that could test for something like this. They put things into it that they thought would be around during those early times of the Earth's development. So they put water over here on the side, okay, to symbolize kind of the ocean or the steam. They give it a heat source, so they heat that up, and then that water is going to go up through the tubes, okay, up through the glass tubes and into this next container here. And this is where it's going to get zapped with a huge dose of energy. Okay, it's going to get a lot of lightning that comes through it. But at the same time that's getting that steam, that water is getting that lightning, there are other molecules in here, CH4, H2, NH3, these inorganic compounds, okay, um, that are going to interact with that and with the lightning. So they gave it the extra energy. It's in steam form, so it's super hot. It's super heated. Okay? And then it goes through a condenser. And a condenser is basically just something that cools it down. So now all of a sudden the temperature drops pretty drastically. So we've shot the water up, we've zapped it with the extra energy with the lightning, and now we're going to cool it back down and condense it. And then the idea would be to test, well, what's down here, right? What's down here in that trap? What type of sample do we have? Are there organic compounds inside, even though we started with a bunch of inorganic material? And when they tested it, that's what they found. Yay! Check, check, check. Yes, there are organic compounds in that cooled water. So out of inorganic compounds with the right conditions of heat and electricity to provide extra energy, they were able to create the organic molecules that would be the backbone for life. Okay. However, there was a problem. They did some more testing. They looked for evidence of, are those molecules really there? Is that really what was there in the early time of Earth, in the atmosphere? And does it make sense that those molecules would be there? If these weren't there, then it wouldn't make sense that would be the generation of organic material. And they did some research and they found out, no, these are not in the atmosphere, not in the atmosphere. Okay. Now, disheartening, yes, but they still set the precedent to say that in these exact conditions, it is possible to make these organic compounds from from those inorganic compounds. So they're like, okay, cool, great. It's not in the atmosphere. What could we do? Maybe it's somewhere else. I don't know. So some people were out diving back in early 2000, kind of deep in the Atlantic Ocean, down in deep submersible, down diving deep, deep, deep into the ocean. And all of a sudden they came across these. Deep in the Atlantic Ocean, they found the Lost City hydrothermal vents. Okay, so here's a little submarine here, and it's touring these vents. And the one thing that's amazing about these vents is they're way at the bottom of the ocean, but you can look here. Here's one of the vents. It's almost 40 meters high. Okay, here's an apartment building that's about 50 meters high. So we're talking about a vent that is, like, what is that, about 30, 35 stories tall. Okay. These gargantuan structures that almost look like skyscrapers sitting underneath. And what a hydrothermal vent is something that's obviously in the water and it's releasing heat. And it's a vent of materials that are inside the Earth's crust. Okay, so it's letting out really superheated water from the Earth's crust. Okay, and in that superheated water, there is going to be materials and compounds inside there. Okay, um, so here's a zoom in on one of those vents. Okay, so that water gets superheated. You can kind of see when the fuzzy stuff around here, that's the steam being released. And when that steam gets released, okay, it cools down. This vent grows bigger. So as the vent releases more and more steam, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the compounds that are inside that steam are going to cool off when they hit the water, and eventually they'll solidify back onto the structure, which is how these massive, huge 40-story high kind of buildings of stone were created. The scientists thought, okay, well, we didn't find these molecules we wanted in the atmosphere. Maybe we can find them somewhere else. And it turns out they're right. So they went in and they analyzed the steam. They took some of the samples from there and they looked for those same molecules that were in the original experiment to see if they were there and if they were present in that steam. And they found them. So by finding them there, they realized, hey, maybe they didn't happen in the atmosphere. Okay? Maybe just because those molecules weren't there in the atmosphere doesn't mean it didn't happen. And maybe instead it took place somewhere near the Earth's crust. Okay? Maybe life was formed near the Earth's crust, or those organic compounds were formed near the Earth's crust where these vents would be, where all that steam and that pressure and all of that energy from inside the Earth's crust and all those minerals and all the compounds that are down there were released and fused and reacted in a given way, especially when they hit the lightning that was coming in from up above, okay? And something triggered there. So your assignment for the rest of the time is an article that kind of talks about the science of this process, okay? And how these thermal events actually have shown, when they've researched these thermal events further, it's shown that this probably is where that first creation of organic compounds happened.